Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm President and CEO of ENO, and let me extend my best wishes to you and your families. I hope that everybody is staying safe and staying well. Today, we present a rapid response webinar on the Transportation Appropriations extension that is moving its way through Congress right now, as well as the one-year FAST Act extension. We're going to address some questions here. How are these going to be implemented? What is their implementation going to mean for things like COVID funding and a long-term FAST Act reauthorization? And of course, I am joined virtually by Jeff Davis. Who else but Jeff Davis to talk about these really important issues. And really, this is my favorite kind of webinar. I get to sit back and listen to Jeff's insights and everything he has to say about this. You all know Jeff. He is a senior fellow with ENO and the editor of ENO Transportation Weekly. Transportation Weekly has been the go-to source of information, analysis, and perspectives on all things transportation for 20 years. And nobody knows these issues better than Jeff. So as I said, I'm going to sit back and listen to Jeff's insights and analysis. You are encouraged to submit questions. This is an AMA style webinar. Jeff's going to have some remarks, but then we're going to take any of your questions and comments. Please do so by using the questions function on the webinar interface there. You don't have to wait until Jeff is done to submit questions. We've already got a couple that have come in already, so please continue to send those in. Looking forward to this, and with that, take it away, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Rob. Interesting times. I've got to actually record something for a webinar down in Texas. It's going to be, I think, next Tuesday or Wednesday, and they asked me to do it in advance. I said, well, if you're talking about funding stuff, there's no sense in doing it 3 weeks in advance because everything's going to happen in those last days leading up to the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. So basically in the House this week, a wide bipartisan majority passed a bill that's a combination of a continuing appropriations measure from October 1st to December 11th and a one-year extension of the FAST Act. As clean an extension as I've ever seen in terms of no, a few changes in policy and no changes in funding levels. The vote in the House was 359 to 57 with one guy voting present. Then in the Senate, Mr. McConnell and Mr. Schumer collaborated enough to expedite putting it on the calendar and starting debate, which happened yesterday. And they've locked in a debate limiting cloture vote for Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. And that will allow, even if some numbnut wants to run out the full 30 hours of post-closure debate to make a point, the bill can still get to President Trump's desk overnight on September 30th. And as long as they get it signed before close of business on the morning of the 1st, in the past, OMB has determined that you're not going to have an overnight shutdown. Shutdowns don't start until close of business in the morning. So it looks very much, unless something goes drastically wrong, that we will avert the normal shutdown drama at least until December. And in addition, in the last 24 hours, it's become clear that even though the CR is clean and the highway transit extension is clean, meaning no additional COVID aid is in there, talks have restarted in the last 24 hours about at least the House maybe voting on another COVID bill as soon as next week, because the House passed its $3.445 trillion HEROES Act back in May. That may as well have been back in the Stone Age for a lot of these nervous members. There were about 10 to 20 Democrats who were in the House who were on the verge of signing discharge petitions to bring up Republican-targeted COVID bills because they're so antsy about wanting to vote for something else positive between now and the elections. And Speaker Pelosi has been opposed to that. She's been an all or nothing on restarting the global negotiations with Republicans on their big bill. But in the past 24 hours, she may have seen the light and ordered a downsized COVID bill coming to the floor as soon as next week. Still not clear if they're ever going to get agreement with Trump in the Senate on a bill between now and the elections, but at least putting them on record as voting for something new related to COVID in the next couple of weeks. So that's what's happening, and we're glad to take questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff. A couple of things are coming in, and they're really kind of, I think, broad questions around the two things we started at the beginning. So let's just take these in order. You were starting to talk about the CARES Act 2.0 there at the end. Anything that we know about that? Anything we know about that, particularly as it relates to transportation funding? There's a lot of discussion around airlines and aviation in the media. obviously transit agencies needed. What any prognostication about what that looks like?
It's going to have something. Okay, first of all, the big sticking point has always been the $1 trillion that was in the HEROES Act for general purpose fiscal relief for state and local governments. And Steny Hoyer has actually been very clever about this. He's been the one advocating a smaller bill, because if you read the fine print, half of the general purpose state aid, $250 billion, and 1/3 of the general purpose city county aid of $125 billion. So it's a total of $375 billion under their bill wasn't going to go out until April 2021 anyway. So Hoyer is pitching this whole thing as we can truncate the time frame of the bill and knock out a lot of, and lower the dollar cost that way, and then take up another bill in the spring without necessarily cutting back on the priorities. So they're going to truncate a lot of the money that was not going to go out till next year anyway, and then they're going to add things that weren't an immediate priority in May but are now. And they're definitely going to put something in there about airline relief, because the unions are really on the Democratic leadership about the massive job losses that are going to come at several airlines on October 1st, once the grace period for that previous $32 billion in aviation aid from the CARES Act in March runs out. The two Republican chairmen in the Senate, Wicker from Commerce and Susan Collins at Appropriations Subcommittee, introduced their own bill this week in the Senate. Was going to provide another $25.5 billion for passenger carriers, I think $300 million for cargo carriers, and $3 billion for contractors. Roughly, doubling down the passenger amount of money of 25 from the CARES Act in exchange for a continuation of the no layoffs policy. Something like that will almost certainly be in a House bill if one is brought up. In addition, the CARES Act, the HEROES Act that the House passed in May, only had $15.75 billion from mass transit providers, following up on the 25 that have been for CARES. The New York MTA is adamant that they need, I think, 12 or 14, and you've got to upgrade the whole national total to around $32 billion in additional aid to get them that amount of money. And APTA has kind of gone along with their $32 billion ask, so that they would probably increase the amount of transit funding in a new Democratic bill. As for the rest of it, no clue. A lot of it depends on how specific they're going to be with giving general purpose aid to state and local governments versus directly saying, no, you have to give X amount of this money to your highway subsidiary or your transit subsidiary or your airport subsidiary or your education department, whatever. It's all about how far they want to go to micromanage. I should also say there was some interesting data from the Tax Foundation this week that the state and local tax revenue apocalypse may not be as bad as people were fearing in March, April, and May. Most states use the July 1st to June 30th deadline, and the Tax Foundation published all of the actual data for that last quarter, April, May, June, and it was terrible on the income tax side, but a lot of that is just because the federal deadline moved, so the state's deadlines had to move, and that move pushed it from one fiscal year to another. I haven't seen finals on the adjusted July income tax payments that missed the state fiscal year, but sales taxes in particular, according to the Tax Foundation, are a lot more robust, and they didn't drop nearly as much in that death quarter of April, May, June as people had feared, and the prelim data from July shows a really strong sales tax rebound. Part of that's because people like Amazon have gone a lot farther in having to pay state and local sales tax in the jurisdiction where the order is made nowadays than they used to. So switching from brick and mortar retail to online retail doesn't have nearly as much of a sales tax hit for the states and locals anymore. And I emphasize sales tax just because that's what's usually leveraged for transit agencies as a lot of their local revenue. So again, we've already given transit more than a year's worth of all the transit fares in the country, $19 billion a year. That's all the transit fares are. So then how far beyond that you want to go towards replacing lost dedicated sales tax revenues? You really need to look at the actual facts on the ground of those sales tax revenue collections, I think, before you hit the panic button again on massive amounts of transit aid.
And folks here are actually asking about that very point about how much transit is during the year, whether or not it's been spent. You've done some analysis recently in ETW on how well transit agencies are in spending their money. You want to update a little bit on that?
OMB has put up a website at usaspending.gov that's trying to mimic the detailed financial reporting that went along with the ARA Stimulus Act in 2009 under President Obama. And they're updating all of the, every single grant made in the name of COVID this year is listed on there, and the date on which the grant was obligated, which means they've signed for it and accepted it, and the date that the money's actually spent, which is much farther down the line. A lot of, again, the big transit, and it's taken about 5 weeks to get that up and running. So the last numbers we had were for the period ending July 31st. And a lot of discrepancy. A lot of the big transit agencies, New York City, San Fran, Muni, and a few others, had spent all their money by right after July 31st from the CARES Act in March. But there were still, billions of dollars that people hadn't even finished applying for their grants yet. So the problem with the formulas that were used by Congress in sending out that $25 billion under the CARES Act was that it wasn't particularly need-based in terms of revenue. So some transit agencies aren't going to need the amount of money they were given under the CARES Act for quite some time. Others are putting their money on they're anticipating it throughout their fiscal 2021 budgets, and they've got a plan to use the money in the future. They may not have drawn it down yet. And whereas, New York spent it all pretty quickly, San Fran Muni spent it all pretty quickly, et cetera. So the questions are not just how much money will be given to transit in a future round of COVID aid. It's about, do they use formulas at all? Because it's proven just about impossible to write a formula that lets everybody spend money, that gives everyone the amount of money they need when they need it. So there, and as reluctant as Congress is to give any administration, particularly this administration, a blank check on and no direction, and trusting their judgment on how to spend money, there's probably no choice for transit aid other than to just let FTA say, okay, demonstrate if you need it, and maybe we'll give it to you. So that's probably what's going to have to happen to avoid massive amounts of unspent money piling up for months or the better part of the year, or for the agencies that don't need it. And every single grant is in there. I mean, the smallest one I saw was like $30,000 for the Nome, Alaska Indian community or something. So yeah, they're all in there.
Yep, demonstrates the urgency we had at the time, I think. Let me ask a very specific question. This one came. I'm going to read this one. Would the CR allow the administration to produce a NOFO for the prorated amount included in the CR, approximately 20% of $1 billion, or is a full year funding package required to move forward? Could you speak to both what's possible and probable for the USDOT under those circumstances?
The CR is 72 days, 31 in October, 30 in November, 11 in December. 72 days divided by 365. OMB rounds that to 2 digits. So it's 19.73% of every 2020 appropriation is provided by the CR that will hopefully be signed next week. Just because it's provided doesn't mean it goes out. There's several provisions in this CR that are taken word for word from boilerplate from previous CRs, including that you're not supposed to initiate or resume any project or activity that wasn't available during 2020. You're not supposed to, if you're a program that has high initial rates of operation for grants, you're not supposed to make those under a CR. And quote, no grants shall be awarded for such programs funded by this act that would impinge on final funding prerogatives, unquote. And there's another boilerplate that says that only the most limited funding action permitted shall be taken under the CR, unquote. And so you add all those together, even though there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are being provided by this CR for grant programs like BUILD, like the various general fund plus ups for highways and transit, like mass transit CIG, practically speaking, the DOT has always interpreted this as meaning they cannot make any grants basically under a CR. They wait to put the NOFO out until, and particularly with BUILD, because BUILD doesn't technically exist. It's rewritten anew every year by Congress in the Appropriations Act. So you definitely can't do a BUILD NOFO before you actually see what, if Congress creates a BUILD program for 2021, and if so, what the funding conditions are. They change a bit every year. Now that puts, normally also, this is interesting for Amtrak, because Amtrak normally gets 3 or 4 big checks a year. That's the entirety of their $2 billion some is handed over, and it's normally not done during a CR. Last year, Amtrak got almost all its money in February, I think, of 2020 for fiscal. So, they waited till the CRs were over and the regular year-long bill was enacted, and then they started the process of giving Amtrak its money. This year, they're 19.73% of their $2 billion. Amtrak needs money, and if we don't get another round of COVID before the elections, and we should know by the end of next week if that's going to happen or not, there's an argument for maybe giving Amtrak a partial year grant under a CR, because they really need it. Similarly, the Federal Highway Administration always apportions prorated amounts of obligation limitation under all but the shortest CRs. Last year, the CR went through November 21st, and they put out, like October 10th, they put out whatever the prorated amount of money was. And I expect FHWA to do that, this year. Late next week, early the week after, they'll put out the what's it going to be? $9.15 billion of obligation limitation to the 50 states and DC for formula stuff. FTA normally doesn't do that for the big transit formula grant. And FTA has had a policy in the past of not apportioning transit formula grant ob limit or contract authority, for that matter, under a partial year CR unless the CR goes at least like 5 or 6 months. And we haven't heard a lot of loud complaints from states about that in the past. But this year that's $2.0 billion. And it's a lot harder this year for FTA to justify sitting on $2 billion cash until December or January, when so many transit agencies are pleading poverty. But if there's not another round of COVID aid, I expect a lot of transit agencies to start begging FTA to go ahead and give them their share of the $2 billion cash that will be created on October 1st if the CR is signed, because even though the conditions on the transit money aren't changed for COVID, so big UZAs above 200,000, they still can't use it for operating expenses, but you've already seen a lot of transit agencies taking some of their own capital money and transferring it to operations, and getting their share of this $2 billion quickly would backstop that and enable more transfer of local capital to local operating while they wait for more COVID aid. So that's something that transit agencies can start pestering FTA for if this CR is signed into law.
Got it. A couple clarifying questions. Is there any funding in any kind of relief package talked about for private bus carriers?
Not if it didn't exist already. I mean, I think the over the road, there's a teeny little TSA set aside for, not TSA, FEMA security grant set aside for over the road buses. So the prorated amount of that would be continued. But again, that would be just a de minimis amount, and probably they couldn't make grants under it anyway. So unless the program was already in existence and operation and actively doing things in fiscal 2020, nothing new is added by either the extension of the surface part or the CR part.
Got it. And does Collins Wicker do anything for Amtrak? It's just aviation?
No, it was just aviation.
So I'm going to shift over to
I should mention that the House HEROES Act didn't have any extra Amtrak money in May. That's another thing that we'll probably address if the Democrats do an updated version of a Democratic-only bill next week.
Got it. So let's shift over to the FAST Act. Just any general kind of comments on what you think the 1-year extension is going to mean for any prospects for long-term reauthorization? We knew it was going to be hard to do long-term reauthorization at the end here of 2020 for lots of different reasons, but what does a 1-year extension do, you think?
Well, it officially throws in the towel on forcing Congress to do any of the hard work on making the decisions related to a long-term FAST Act extension this year. So it means we're going to wait until after the elections and see who's in charge in starting January 3rd in each chamber of Congress and January 20th over at 1600, and then defer to them to allow to determine the course of action next year. In the event that Trump is reelected, who knows? Once he's in a second term, he's already willing to sign anything that'll get to his desk, and his willingness to stand up to traditional Republican spending dogma may be increased. Who knows? If it's Biden, he's going to have a plan, but he's going to have a lot of plans for a lot of things that will take a while to get going. And my general sense is that the first 6 months of next year are going to largely be dominated by getting a budget resolution through the House and the Senate, so assuming they get nominal control of the Senate too, getting a budget through with the majority, and then making all of the major first-term fiscal policy changes, taxes, entitlements, what have you, in one big budget reconciliation bill that'll be signed into law by summer. That's the way that Clinton did it, because in part the debt ceiling is currently suspended. It pops back into being August 31st, 2021. We've been generating a lot of debt, and so the debt ceiling increases in stressful times are usually packaged in a big bill like a reconciliation bill. And so getting that done in time for debt limit next year is probably going to be the big issue. So then the question becomes, do you deal with the tax and revenue issues relating to highway trust fund solvency in the big train that's moving in a reconciliation bill that's already going to make trillions of dollars of tax law changes anyway, or do you deal with highway trust fund solvency in an authorization bill? And it's, if you're going to ask anybody to pay for anything, and in real dollars, pay real dollars, it's a lot easier to do it in the big party line vote that everyone else is doing. The big pay for T21 of 1998 was in the 1997 tax reconciliation bill. They put the money in there, the trust fund then, and then Schuster wrote the bill a year later to spend the money. And so that's I tend to think that if it's starting over next year, the revenue issues they'll have a plan for how to do the highway trust fund revenue, but that the revenue side of that plan may get implemented in the ginormous tax reconciliation bill that'll be moving through, and the surface transportation bill may have to wait a little bit until that gets done so they see how much money they're going to have and they go along and spend it.
Very interesting. That's the kind of insights you get from Jeff on this. So a couple of questions around the trust fund. Let me just take one of the big ones. A couple of folks that want to know, what are the latest CBO projections on the solvency of the highway trust fund mean for the ability to fully fund the 12-month extension of the FAST Act?
It was actually weird. CBO only said, I think it was like a little less than $7 billion was going to be needed to get through September 30th, 2021 at current spending levels. And the DOT's most lowest number was like 18.6. They're normally not that far apart, but apparently there's a large number of unopened hard copy gasoline and diesel tax returns sitting over the IRS because of the long months of non-mail opening backlog. So the normal level of uncertainty when you have to go back and every 3 or 4 months and correct the estimated tax payments that are made every 2 weeks, based on the actual returns, much more uncertainty this year and much more delay. So there's normally a gigantic correction baked into the September numbers every year. So I can't wait to see in 3 weeks, what that winds up being. But anyway, so the Congress in this current extension that the House passed this week split the difference, and it's got $13.6 billion of additional transfers from the general fund to the trust fund, 10.4 for the highway account, 3.2 for the mass transit account. That brings that 13.6 will almost certainly be enough to get the trust fund through September 30th, 2021, maybe a little bit after. That brings the total general fund bailouts of the trust fund to $153.5 billion since September 2008, and you add in the $3.7 billion of reallocated gas and diesel taxes from the Lust Trust Fund to the Highway Trust Fund, 157.2 is your transfer total to keep things solvent over the last 12 years. And CBOs, they redid their projections of the future spending September 2nd, and it was interesting because in the long term, it didn't really change that much because of COVID. This is the first time they've had to redo their model since COVID. And while the tax receipts were down, but not as much as you would have thought during those terrorizing days in March, April, May. But spending would also be slower because states are having more trouble finding matching funds, and transit agencies in particular were going to, slow their obligation of capital money out of the trust fund because they would be busy spending their general fund COVID money. And when you subtract when you add the lower spending levels to the lower tax levels, the long-term change is about even, but same as it was back in January. So the long-term picture didn't change that much.
And how about the AATF on aviation? Same projections on whether it's going to be sufficient to last the year?
Well, yeah, the president requested a change up in the CR that would retroactively say, okay, instead of taking all these appropriations for FAA capital and research and the lion's share of FAA operations from the trust fund, let's just say that they took 2020 out of the general fund instead and do that for 2021, which would have meant that the only dollars going out of the trust fund before the $3.5 billion a year airport grant program, and things would have been fine. The appropriators decided not to do that, and instead the CR will put an additional $14 billion into the trust fund, which should roughly be a little more than the amount of the airport and airway trust fund excise taxes that have been suspended since April as part of the CARES Act. And again, I'm not sure how they model that, because even if the taxes hadn't been suspended, the number of people flying and the amount of cargo, the number of people flying dropped so much that the taxes would have been well below baseline anyway. But there's $14 billion. I think the trust fund was taking in like 16 a year in taxes, something like that. And so the amount of money that will be put in the trust fund next week, if this CR passes, will definitely make up for the fiscal 2020 lost revenue and a good chunk of the fiscal 2021 lost revenue through December 31st, and then we'll see where we go from there. The trust fund had a really good uncommitted balance coming into this year, so really healthy to the point that they were going to stop appropriating general fund money at all for the FAA for a couple of years, and so that's obviously gone by the wayside now. But there was a good amount of money in there to begin with.
Yeah, hard to believe how fast things have changed here.
Mm-hmm.
A big broad kind of general question: are there going to be new restrictions on spending in the FAST Act CR?
No, it's as clean a extension of the FAST Act as I remember seeing. Every dollar amount, every policy is carried forward by 1 year. From September 30th, 2020 to September 30th, 2021. There are like there were 3 or 4 tiny little changes, and then 2 of them are logical in the sense that there were 2 things. The FAST Act had 2 aggregate funding limits. It was for the infra grant program. It said $500 million over 5 years. Up to that amount can be spent on non-highway freight projects. And there was some little R&D program where like 21 million over 5 years could be spent for in-car anti-DUI tech. And so since we're adding a 6th year to the FAST Act increases those limits, from 500 million over 5 years to 600 million over 6 years, and whatever the equivalent amount is on that research thing. That makes sense. Also, the FAST Act had a provision that was going to cut off all subsidies to Amtrak for food and beverage losses as of December 4th, 2020. They went ahead and repealed that. They weren't going to make it anyway, but obviously they can't during COVID. It would have been interesting to see the debate in a COVID-free world of whether or not to repeal that provision, but they went ahead and killed that. And they extend some expiring RIF loan transit-oriented development sunset. But yeah, but it's an extremely clean in terms of free from policy changes and free from changes in funding levels extension. But however, the extension does require the apportionment calculations to be run all over again. As I point out in ETW this week, that means that because Texas's fuel tax, more trucking tax payments into the highway trust fund keep going up and up and up. So in order to make sure that Texas was made whole for their 95% guaranteed rate of return on their tax dollars, they get an increase in funding this year of, what was it? It was, $239 million. And everyone else in the country, 50 states, the other 49 states in DC, have to eat their prorated share of Texas's $2 to $39 million increase, because the total amount is still frozen at $43.37 billion. And if Colorado had taken its share of that cut, it would have pushed them just below their 95% threshold. So Colorado gets like a $3 million gain over last year, and Texas gets a $239 million gain, and everyone else collectively is $242 million less than they were in 2020 because of the gas tax adjustment, which as we point out at ad nauseum, is the only variable left in the formula. All the other variables have been set in stone since 2007.
And just 2 commercials from me then for folks. Definitely check out Jeff's article in ETW this week. It's a very unique analysis about what he just talked about with the having how to keep the states whole, what it means, the kind of the Texas issue. It's really interesting analysis. And then also check out a report from this last year. It's called the Status Quo.
Fixing status quo, yeah.
Fixing the Status Quo, where Jeff and Paul Lewis talk about the programs and just how frozen in place a lot of these formulas are. Certainly check that out. Here's a question. I'm just going to go and read this one. There was an earlier consideration of waiving local match requirements for federal transportation funding next year. I guess because it's a clean extension, it's not in there. But is that anything like that in the extension? That
is not in the extension. That will almost certainly be in any future COVID relief bill, because its score is not costing the federal government a dime. All it does is it reduces the bang for the buck that the federal highway and transit program dollars have. If the state or local transit agency no longer has to put up 20% of the share, then the federal dollars will buy 20% less. The same reason that CBO has always said that repealing Davis-Bacon won't score. It's inverted. The federal government would get more bang for its buck if you repeal Davis-Bacon, but the actual dollars going out of the federal treasury wouldn't change. So I fully expect a temporary waiver of the federal matching share for highways and transit in the next COVID bill, because that's been done 3 or 4 other times in the program's history since 1959. They did it the first time, and then 58 temporarily in times of economic recession.
And I think you may have addressed this already. Maybe folks just chiming in now. What does the CR mean for infra grants, for the next round of infra grants?
Even though it will put $193.7 million technically towards the on infra. I'm sorry. In the past, FHWA, the entire year of contract authority will be put out there on October 1st when this extension is signed. So this is where the extension and the CR have to work in cooperation. So you have the full $1 billion of infra contract authority put out there. We won't know until there's a final appropriations bill how much of that will be lopped off due to the eventual obligation limitation. Could be 9 or 10%. So they cannot responsibly give out the whole thing. If they wanted to, they could. They've done this before once. I think they did give out some initial funding based on projects in a previous year's NOFO under a CR. They could give out, 160 or so, up to $150, $160 million between now and November if they wanted to. There would not be a legal problem with doing that. I very much doubt they will, but in theory they could give out, to be safe, about $150 million of the infra money between now and then, but I don't expect them to do so.
Got it. Could you please expound further on the FTA $2 billion that will become available on 10/1? How is it shared among agencies, and is it a specific grant?
It's the prorated share. The obligation limitation on the transit formula grants account was $10.15 billion in fiscal year 2020. Under the terms of the CR, 19.73% of that 10.15 obligation limitation will be created and given to FTA right after October 1st. That's about $2 billion even. The full year amount of contract authority for that program is being created. So because the full year of contract authority is created, FTA could apportion that money through all the they have to rerun all the various formula allocations and so forth, the formula computations for all these various programs. Basically are the capital bus program, the main transit capital grants are the urbanized area formula grant, rural formula grant, elderly disabled, and what used to be called rail mod, fixed highway modernization, is now state of good repair There's also a heavy bus tier and the formula part of bus grants. Those are the big tickets under that transit formula grants program. The FTA could apportion 19.73% of each of those formula programs under the CR and give that money to transit agencies between now and December and free money up. Their practice has been, because the formula apportionment process and then getting those agreements signed is a paperwork pain in the butt. It has been their practice not to do it for anything less than about a half year's worth of money. But this year, transit agencies need money so badly that maybe they'll reconsider. Who knows?
Yeah, a lot of questions around the infra grants and just how all that's going to be affected. So I think we've got that covered. Here's a very specific one. I'm going to read this one. There is a FAST Act program where the NOFO goes from 2018 through September 30, 2020. Completed applications are evaluated and award demonstrations are made in an open rolling basis. So how does the CR impact the end date for a program like that if there's still funding available?
They won't, okay, presumably some share of the extension will create a full 2021 amount of contract authority for that program. I don't think the way that the CR gets interpreted, they'll be able to give any of that money out, of the 2021 tranche of money out during the CR. If there's 2020, 2019, 2018 money still left over, FTA will be able to give that money out. FHWA will be able to, or whoever it is, they will be able to give that money out during the period of this CR, but they won't be able to give out any of the fiscal 2021 grant money under the CR. So I get, without knowing how much was left unobligated, as of next week from the previous years, I can't tell you how much more, is left.
Here's an existential question. What if the CR doesn't pass?
If the CR doesn't pass, then, and something goes terribly wrong in the Senate, then on the morning of October 1st, everybody in the federal government will have to, I don't know how this will work in COVID, because before COVID, you had to physically show up at the office to get your furlough notice and then be sent home. I'm not sure how virtual furlough notices will work if the CR goes up, but because, so a lapse of appropriations shutdown would send home anyone whose salary is paid for out of annual general fund appropriations. And then also separately, a highway trust fund obligation shutdown would send home anybody whose salaries are paid for out of the highway trust fund. The essential people would still show up, the presidential appointees would still show up for work. The essential people under the life, health, safety exception, like air traffic controllers, would have to show up. And people who get paid from these weird accounts that have advanced funding, like, FAA Capital, I think, is a year in advance. So some of that money would still be available. Some people would get to show up. But for the most part, you would have both the trust fund side of the highway trust fund side of DOT and the general fund side of DOT would be shut down next Wednesday, I guess, if the CR doesn't pass.
But the likelihood of that is pretty slim.
The president wants this thing passed. McConnell and Schumer both want it passed. And the way they've got it set up, assuming that they have 60 votes, and they had unanimous consent to bring it up yesterday. That's the key, is that if anyone had wanted to really hold it up, they could have raised an objection yesterday, and McConnell would have had to file a bunch more motions and keep them in over the weekend. That didn't happen. So they let the act of bringing the bill up go unanimously. And so that's a good indication to me that no one is really invested in burning the building down to stop this thing.
Well, there you go. That's a positive thing right there. Trying to keep these in order, but I'm going to bounce around a little bit now. Any thoughts on what a 1 year extension might mean for a big infrastructure package? So if there's a change in administration next year, and if this is something that the new administration wants to do, any I guess more of a political question. Any prospects on what would happen to a big infrastructure bill next year?
it's very possible there will be a big infrastructure bill no matter who's elected, because Biden's definitely going to try to do one, and Trump will be a reelected Trump would be freer to negotiate with Pelosi and whoever is in charge in the Senate without having to worry about so much about keeping Republican anti-debt people on board. But the question has always been, do you do the regular reauthorization of these highway trust fund programs, which is a recurring thing that has to be done anyway, in the same package as a broader one-time infrastructure stimulus type bill, or do you do them separately? The House wound up using the surface transportation extension that we needed to do anyway as the basis for its infrastructure package that has passed. The Senate was looking like it was, at one point they were talking about doing the water bill and the surface bill as a mini infrastructure package, and that just fell apart. So the Senate hasn't been able to figure out what to do or how to pay for it. The House didn't know how to pay for it either. And yeah, I think you will see a lot of talk about a big infrastructure bill next year, no matter who wins. But the question has always been, do you delay reauthorization of the highway trust fund stuff so you can put more, broader infrastructure in context, or what? I will also say that the House bill, Chairman Neal is very big on bringing up as many new varieties of bonding and tax exempt funding, whatever, a version of Build America bonds, and whether that happens in a standalone infrastructure bill or as part of a surface transportation bill or as part of the big gigantic tax reconciliation bill we're going to have next year, who knows? It doesn't really matter what bill creates these things as long as they get created.
I'm going to collect a bunch of questions or comments about Buy America. Any thoughts on how Buy America changes with the CRs, with the extensions, or with a potential big infrastructure package next year?
There are no changes in Buy America in the CR or the extension, and it's been amazing, given where the debate on Buy America used to be 5-10 years ago, that it's the one thing that Republicans and Democrats seem to be able to agree on in the infrastructure talks this year is strengthening Buy America, particularly vis-a-vis China. They cannot step on each other, all over each other fast enough to take a more anti-China stance in a lot of these bills. There are a lot of things that, again, there is no single Buy America program. There are separate rules that apply to highway dollars, transit dollars, Amtrak dollars, airport grant dollars, non-Amtrak FRA dollars, et cetera. And none of them quite sync up with the others. So these were added as riders over a period of years. And so there's a strong policy argument made that we need to unify the DOT Buy America requirements across modal lines. For example, if you use your FTA grant money to buy a bus, there's one set of Buy America rules. There are a different set of rules if you flex some of your highway money, your CMAQ money over to buy a bus. That's stupid. So there are. I think Daniel Lipinski had a bill to really streamline and synchronize a lot of these. So there are, and as far as percentages, the Obama administration were the ones that wanted to increase the mass transit rolling stock Buy America component weight to up to 100%. And APTA wound up talking them out of it because they said that it's just not possible for some of these bus and rail car components. But you could eventually see serious discussion of increasing the rolling stock Buy America percentage above current levels in the next bill.
We are close to being out of time, so let me just some cleanup questions. You mentioned the $19 billion would cover all transit nationwide. Is that from March to December 2020 or 2020?
No, the $19 billion was the last time the National Transit Database was updated, that APTA puts the money in the Transit Fact Book. I forget if it was calendar year 2018 or calendar year 2019. That was the sum total of all fares collected by all transit providers in the country in one, I can't remember fiscal calendar year. It was the last year for which the National Transit Database recorded the total fares were about $19 billion.
I think APTA's fact book probably also has that current stuff too.
Yeah.
And So a bunch of questions too about the website that you mentioned at the very beginning on that was tracking the spending coming out from the CARES Act.
USAspending.gov has their little COVID tracker you can click on, and you can click on it by budget account or by department, and then you do it by account, and then click on, and then you can find individual grant recipients, contracts, etc.
And if you didn't get that, this addresses another question. Folks are wondering if this is all going to be available in a recording. Yes, you can get this webinar and all of the Eno webinars on our YouTube channel. I forget what the address is, but if you go to YouTube and search for Eno Center for Transportation, you should be able to find that pretty quickly. And Jeff, just the other set of questions that are on here are not really questions. They're mostly thank yous for everybody saying, thank you for clarifying that for me. I had lots of questions about that. Thank you for making that so understandable. So for a lot of folks, I think the benefit here you provide is really making the very arcane and the very detailed and specific very clear for folks. So thank you for that. Thank you all for your participation on the webinar here today. If you'd like more information about Eno and about kind of who we are and what we do, go to our website, www.enotrans.org. There you can find information about Eno Transportation Weekly, which Jeff has been running and editing for 20 years. Certainly sign up. If you didn't know that it was a valuable source of transportation information, you certainly know it now here in Jeff's comments. So Jeff, thank you very much.
Thanks. You're welcome for all the compliments, and I will now go back to trying to finish this week's issue of ETW, by later this afternoon.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jeff. So long, everybody.